Good morning, everyone. I trust you can hear me. I was telling someone earlier, I have rarely had the complaint that we cannot hear you. People have made other observations about the volume of my speaking, but rarely that I can't be heard. So in the event that there is some difficulty for those of you towards the back of the room, please just wave and I'll elevate it further, and I'll hope not to overwhelm the folks who are here in the front. So a couple of things. We're going to talk about district manager, general manager, or executive director, whatever that title is, performance evaluation. And there's a section at the very end for us to address questions, etc. But I find that when I'm on the seated side as opposed to the standing side, sometimes my question doesn't feel nearly as critical or important if I have to hang on to the very end. So please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions as we go along. If it begins to get a little bit more complicated, etc., I may ask that we chat about it after the session, just so that we can stay timely with everything. Your handout material should include two things. One, a copy of all the slides that I'll use, and two, some additional information about questions or criteria, things that you might want to solicit as part of your evaluation process. And these are built with the idea that you may just do board or commission evaluation in terms of just that one way. Or you may ask for input from direct reports or employees or the community, etc. So I've tried to provide information about all of those in the event that you have a more robust process than simply evaluation from the board or the commissioners. So hopefully that will be helpful to you, and we'll chat about a bit of those as we go along. My intention is to stand so that I can see most of you, but I have this quirky hip that the doctor has said is displaced. I don't like that word a lot, but occasionally I may find that I have to sit down for a moment to kind of let it settle back into someplace. And so I apologize if that's the case. You will hear the voice, but for those of you further away, it will be a bit disembodied as I duck down behind these folks and sit down. So I appreciate your forgiveness in advance. So I want us to talk just a bit about the session objectives, the things that we're really trying to accomplish here. And then I want to find out whether or not there's something else that brought you here at 8:30 on Saturday morning that you really want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about. So you will notice that what I really want to start on is kind of what's the process of the evaluation. And to be able to think about that, we also need to think about the purpose. What's are we really trying to accomplish by doing this? What's a good evaluation, kind of step by step? And as you might imagine, there are several different approaches that can be effective. What are some different ways of conducting the evaluation? Does the chair of the board sit down? Does the chair and the vice chair sit down? Or is it done with all of the commissioners in executive session? I mean, there are a variety of different ways that organizations approach this. And what I would say simply about it is try and find something that feels comfortable for the largest number of people, and that is going to serve your purpose of being able to communicate the things that are really most critical. What documents would you use in this process, and where might those come from, and who might generate those? I think that becomes an important piece, and I'll tell you why in just a second. And then what kind of questions do you have? So who had something other than this, these items on your agenda, or that you really hoped we would talk about something specific in the session this morning? What else should we add to this? Did I tell you I'm much happier with a participative session where we all kind of are engaged? And because otherwise, you know, even with all of you in the room, it can feel a little lonely up here. Yes, please.
I'm interested in if you could address if there are
Okay, good point. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I want to know if we should involve the general public in the evaluation.
Okay, the question, in case you couldn't hear it, is should we involve the general public in the evaluation? And I think most organizations would say not necessarily in a formal way, but in an informal way, the anecdotal notes or the conversations or comments that are made can certainly be documented and included. So we can chat about that. Yes, sir.
Could you address situations where the director may be a contracted position versus non-contracted, and maybe the nuances involved in the evaluation?
Okay. Yeah, that really would play back to what you built into the contract. So I don't know that there's a single answer to that. I would certainly include if there are employment agreements or contracts, employment contracts, that the role of the evaluation and some of the activities of that be included in the contract. And frequently I find that that's not discussed at all in employment agreements. So that would be the place to start, is to kind of define it and then make sure that we're doing it in accordance with that. So yeah, we could certainly discuss that. Any other, one more, yes?
This may be part of your presentation, but any corrective action or corrective reviews, written or unwritten, specifically.
Okay, and his comment was about corrective action or corrective reviews, written or unwritten, and the last part of that's really easy. If there's corrective action, it needs to be written, because otherwise, how many people in the room are attorneys? What? No attorneys? Amazing. I have good friends who are attorneys, and they say there is one critical rule, and that is if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. And so nothing can be more critical to document than corrective action, or even what I have been calling lately kind of letters or memos of caution. So I don't want to make it a formal warning, but I do want to alert the appropriate individuals that we're headed in the wrong direction and other kinds of actions are necessary. Yes?
Does the corrective action need to be a board decision, or is it talking about a particular critique from an individual board member?
One of the things that I stress when I do work with boards and commissions is it is only a legitimate action if it is taken by the board. Now, if I, as an individual board member, am struggling a bit with feeling like I don't get enough detail or something, I can certainly have a conversation and say, if you could provide a little more detail, that'd really be helpful to me. That kind of conversation is fine. But if it's going to be official, or if there's going to be action, or if there's going to be later on a cautionary or corrective conversation because of that level of detail, it cannot happen on the basis of a single board member. The board only has power when it is the board acting on the situation, not the individuals. And that is one of the areas where it's frequently discomforting for both the staff and the executive director and other board members when in fact a board member tries to issue directions, edicts, or delegates a specific task to somebody without it being the board that's taking the action and it's the individual. And obviously that can create some challenges. Okay? All right, good ideas, and I'll try and incorporate those as I go along. If I don't touch on them enough, please see me after, and I'll be happy to spend a few more minutes and chat about it. Understanding the evaluation. And you can see the pieces here. It's the process of reviewing past performance and planning for future performance. The best way I know to describe it is, and I don't care so much about the percentages, but a good evaluation is about 50% retrospective and 50% prospective. And the reason is you never changed anybody's performance in the future. by simply recounting past situations. If you aren't clear about what you want more of, what you want less of, the focus or the trajectory of things or the activities that would make things better, speaking to both the what of performance and the how of performance. You really have to talk about what we want to be different, what we want the goals to be, what we want the measurements or objectives to be. And so that split, and again, I don't care if it's 50-50, but 95-5 is too little. So it really needs to be a healthy portion of the conversation about where are we going from here. It is a critical task of the board or commission to conduct this review so that you end up being on the same page relative to priorities, relative to what's important, relative to how measurement or assessment of performance is going to be conducted. Frequently I hear from executive directors, I had my review and it was such a surprise. They talked about A and B and C. And those haven't been the things we've talked about at board meetings, and those aren't the things we talked about last year when we were in budget planning and trying to set priorities. I was so surprised by that. Other times I hear from board members or commission members saying, we did the performance review for our executive director, and he or she was so surprised that we were concerned about thus and so. I mean, and it seems so obvious to us. The problem is there hasn't been that conversation in advance that says, what kinds of criteria, what measures, what are we looking at, what matters to us? We know about some of the, what I'm going to call obvious, how are we doing financially and the budget and those kinds of things, or if there is a serious complaint raised by staff or someone in the community or one of our community partners. But there are a host of other things that can be really critical to the board that perhaps the executive director doesn't have visibility on or doesn't understand is so important, and vice versa. So it's really important to make sure that you have the priorities, the activities, and the idea of what I'm going to be measured on. I need to clearly understand that. And I want to just segue for a moment. One of the things that I have a privilege of doing is working with a number of the members, the districts within special districts. And frequently we're called in when kind of the obvious remedy or the trying to problem solve simply has not been effective. And the situation has gotten more challenging, more negative, more polarized. And so as a result at that point, then I am asked to see whether or not I can be of assistance. And what I sometimes find is that there haven't been reviews done. There haven't been these conversations. And so we didn't start out parallel to one another in the same place. We started out in different places, and the conflict or challenge has driven us even further apart. And so I cannot tell you how critical it is to have these periodic, typically done annually, but periodic reviews to make sure that we are rescaling, that we are on the same page, that we have that conversation. So often I discovered that the genesis of a problem is we weren't in the same place to begin with. We didn't understand or weren't trying to accomplish the same things. And that can happen when commission membership changes. And so we lost a couple of folks and we've got a couple of new voices and they have strong feelings about X and Y, and we never really resolve those before we're then doing the next review. And that can cause some problems. So one of my strongest suggestions is when new members join your commission or board, have a specific conversation about the way we do reviews, what we have used as criteria or measurements before, what kind of process you use, and gain either their opinions about changes or possible alterations, or gain their buy-in to that process so that it doesn't surface later on, and that can be a critical issue that can surface at that point. And so I believe it can be prevented if there are these initial conversations, or at least it can be minimized. And that's a really important step, and candidly, it's not one we often think of when we're just bringing new commissioners on, is to talk about a review that may be several months yet away. So I would encourage you to add that to your new commissioner board orientation and be pretty thorough about that, but also seek any new ideas or impressions they have so that they feel as though the process is not something where it's just being run by everybody who's been here for a while, as opposed to seeking their ideas about how it might be improved. So understanding the purpose of the evaluation, the particulars of it, and making sure that the commission, to the largest degree possible, is kind of in the same place and of the same opinion about it, or that we've acknowledged where our differences are, is really important long before you ever get to the review. Here are some basic management principles, and the performance review process really feeds into all of those. First of all, you need to let people know what's expected of them. And I recognize that this is your most senior job, and in many times these folks are very accomplished, and they have been either with the organization for some period of time and been promoted, or they may have come from another similar position. But please don't assume that they know what you expect and what's really important. And so asking them, what has been expected of you in the past? How have you been evaluated in the past? What kind of measures do you think are really critical? Here are the things we think. Making sure that there is a clear understanding of expectations makes it a whole lot easier for me to perform. But when you say, we're so glad you're here, go forth and do good work, that's not so helpful as you may think. I appreciate the autonomy and independence. I have no idea what the definition, your definition of good work is. So you need to help me a little with what that looks like. And then a chance to perform, and obviously we've got the entire performance period. Prior to our session, someone was saying that their new executive director had been on for 6 months, and they were now planning a 6-month review as a way of being able to say, so here's how it's been so far, and to set up then the annual review to make sure that we don't wander too far away during that first critical year. That's an excellent process to be able to make sure that, and it can be formal, or it can be very informal in terms of simply an executive session conversation in which everybody says, here's how I think it's going. And if I were to grade you today, I'd give you a this, or I would tell you I want a little bit more of or a little bit less of. That's really helpful because that feedback is critical to somebody then being able to know what the expectations are. Obviously giving them help when and as needed, and there are 2 categories for this. When somebody's struggling, and you can tell they're struggling, really trying to comprehend the complicated process and contracting relationship we've had with so-and-so, then we need to be able to say, I'd be happy to spend some time, or the board could have a work session explaining what the history of this is, etc. Or we could delegate that to somebody to sit down and chat with them about it. The second time help is needed is when it's not necessarily clear that they're struggling, but they've asked for specific assistance. So there are times when that's a request. There are times when it isn't a request, and they may even be trying to lightly camouflage the fact that they are not as comfortable or familiar with something, but you say, perhaps it would help if why don't we go ahead and schedule that? Instead of saying, do you need some help? Because guess what happens if you ask me that? The answer is, unless I have a really strong ego and fairly substantial confidence, I'm going to suggest that saying yes to that is an indication of weakness and probably not something I want to show you, because you're my boss.
But you mentioned delegating somebody to do that, to go down and have some conversations. Should that be recorded in the board minutes? That way that person is not acting alone. Absolutely.
So in other words, if I turn to you, what's your name? I'm sorry. Pardon?
Bill.
Bill. If we turn, thank you. Oh, that one's bright and shiny. If the board turns to you and say, Bill, given your involvement with this and your length of service on the board, how about if the board delegates you to go have a conversation with our ED and try and provide them the history and perspective of all of this and what we've been through. May I have a motion to that effect? Okay, fine. Now, Bill, you're authorized and you are acting on behalf of the board, which is a perfectly appropriate thing to do. And then you could report back to the board how well that was absorbed and taken and appreciated and acted upon, and all of that then would be performance feedback. Okay, so that works really well. Let them know how they're doing. No surprises, guys. So along the way, you want to be able to say, and I'm really impressed with the relationships that you have formed here, or the board in conversation has really observed you out in the community and interacting, really creating a positive image. If you've got a concern, then it needs to be talked about, and then that needs to be relayed to the individual, usually by the chair of the board. So as a result, I don't sit down if I'm the ED in the review and hear things I've never heard before, either compliments or concerns. Both of those ought to be something that are previewed unless they happened in the last week before the review. There needs to be that kind of ongoing conversation. And I'm not suggesting that you need to constantly run around and pat him or her on the back and say, good job. But the meaningful things need to be passed on, both pluses and any issues that you're concerned about. And obviously, then the review process is designed to recognize and reward through commentary and acknowledgement and compliment, as well as potentially financially, any of the results. And that's when you think about this being the way management is taught, the kinds of key items, the review really touches on all of those. And that's one of the reasons it's such a critical piece. If you think about the way we do basic management process, there really are 4 steps. We plan for performance, and we do that through the budgeting process for the whole organization, and we should plan for performance for the executive director. We manage the performance, we offer commentary, narrative, encouragement, additional information in terms of managing, and we look periodically at the finances, at the actions taken, the results achieved, etc. We evaluate performance, and we develop performance by building additional professional capabilities or skills, by identifying areas where there's an opportunity for improvement, by acknowledging those things that are done just in a superb fashion, and that goes into planning for performance for the next year. If you think about this organizationally, this is exactly what you do with your districts. It ought to be replicated and paralleled with the process of exactly what you do with your executive director as well. Questions about any of those? Yes?
So, in public sessions or executive sessions, how is this feedback all coming to light?
Executive session is, performance conversations can be had in executive session.
And should that feedback, positive and negative, only occur in executive sessions?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think there is something wonderful to be gained by being able to pass on compliments, or we got a letter from so-and-so and I want to read it in open session. It speaks to how well the district did and specifically to what Bill was able to accomplish in his role as executive director, et cetera. Those are wonderful things to read into the record, their recognition, their acknowledgement, their affirmation. And candidly, if you do a good job of offering me those kinds of things, that when you come to me and say, we've got a concern and we really need to have more intention here, I'm going to hear that a whole lot better because I know that you're also seeing the things that I do that are really positive. So it makes it much easier for me to hear the concerns. Okay, yes?
I think also that the evaluation process needs to be constant and consistent. Starting out, oftentimes organizations will do an evaluation as a point in time.
Yes.
A snapshot of what's going on versus looking at it, as you mentioned, being prospective.
Yes.
Asking ourselves, what do we want for an outcome?
Yes.
And rather, oftentimes that doesn't happen because we need to see the executive director in context with our expected outcomes.
Absolutely. Yes, are they leading the organization to the desired results that the commission has established? And you're absolutely right, they are the snapshot. And all too often they are, what's happened in the last 6-8 weeks? Because that's what we remember, as opposed to the 12 months and then looking forward as well. So we frequently have a much narrower window of performance that gets put into this review than what would be desired. Yes, sir.
Are we assuming that these folks all have a written job description and they're performing against that description?
I want you to know we did not have this conversation before this session. Okay? Here's the diagram. So, here are the organizational goals, what the district wants to accomplish. You need a position description for your general manager or district manager that spells out what is their area of responsibility. And keep in mind that then it becomes a role modeling for the fact that the organization has job descriptions for all the other positions as well. Out of those comes the job standards or the performance standards. Job descriptions typically state what you want done. What are the activities? The job standards are how you want them done. So my job description may say answer the phone. My performance standard may say courteously and by the third ring. The job description is about what is to be done, and it's ordinarily not that detailed at that level. It's going to be at a much higher level. But the idea is it's about what, and performance standards are about how we're going to assess whether or not that activity was carried out appropriately. One of the things, and you will probably hear me say this a couple of more times, I've said it once, and that is performance is made up of two major dimensions: what somebody does and how they do it. And often we hire people for what they can do, and we fire them for how they do it. Instead of looking at the how at the time of hiring in much greater depth, assessing what past practice and patterns of behavior and interactions with people have been, we look at, do they have this skill? Do they have this ability? Have they had this experience? And those are fine criteria. They just shouldn't be the only criteria. We really need to look at how they've done things. So it's amazing how often we hire for what and fire for how. And performance standards frequently have not been talked about, and certainly if they've been considered, they are most often considered by the individual, not the group, not the commission, not the board. How would we measure whether or not this was happening effectively? What kind of measurement would you use? And how do we then coalesce around some of those specific metrics. And that becomes critical because otherwise, and some of you know this, you end up in those performance conversations and you have very different ideas about the performance. You have very different ideas about whether or not it's outstanding or merely adequate. And because we didn't have any kind of conversations to begin with to kind of coalesce around those measurements, it becomes much more difficult, much more contentious, much more divisive at the time now that we are pressured because the review is due in 3 weeks. And that creates a problem. So if we do a little bit more work on the front side, we prevent a tremendous amount of that disagreement and conflict on the backside. But it's all around job standards. And what I frequently find is there is a job description. In many cases, it may be way old, but there is a job description. There just aren't often performance standards in place. Then out of that comes the appraisal process, the report and planning for the next cycle, and how we're going to do that, which feeds into the organizational goals. And again, you have that feedback loop that contains all those pieces. And a little bit more time on the details of this prevents a lot of heartache at the backside. Does that address your question? Because you asked it at exactly the right time. So hopefully I came close to that. Good. Oh, thanks a lot. So let's talk a little bit about how evaluations of an ED are a bit different. And I'm going to sit for a couple of minutes, then I'll bop back up again like a groundhog, okay? Commissioners and boards typically are about policy and public relations and moving the agenda or the mission of the district forward. That becomes the real important piece, is the macro look, the 30,000-foot look, et cetera. And typically commissions and boards only dive down to, if you will, ground level when there is a specific concern or issue that needs to be resolved. But otherwise, they are the supervisors of the executive director. The executive director is the one responsible for staff, is the one responsible for operations, and all the activities to carry out the decisions and the policy of the board. And so the evaluation needs to be written in that kind of thing, that kind of context. The what then becomes far more obvious than the how. There are districts where some of the district directors or commissioners, because they have time available and an interest, or perhaps used to be a staff member until they retired, are spending a fair amount of hours each week in the offices of the district. It is harder under those circumstances to keep that difference, that separation between policy roles versus I'm chatting with a staff member and they raise a concern and I bring it back to, and that's candidly, it's an unfair situation for the executive director. And it places the organization in a posture of some tension and challenge to be able to really respect the roles. But then the question gets asked, so how do commissioners or directors know about the how when what they really see most of the time is the what? They see the activity report, they see the comments and the progress reports at meeting times, those kinds of things, and they don't necessarily see how this is accomplished, how authoritarian and directive is the executive director with staff as opposed to more congenial, more asking, how much micromanagement is going on versus giving employees independence and autonomy to carry out their responsibilities. So being able to inquire about those things in preparation for the review is really an appropriate thing. That's why, and I always try and declare my biases, one of my biases is to have a 360 review, so that it comes from not just the commissioners and the board, but it comes from direct reports. It comes from the employee population. It comes as appropriate with community partners or other agencies that you have contracted relationships with, or close working relationships, or maybe regulatory folks. Or maybe it's the community, and if it is, it's the community leadership as represented by 3 or 4 people who have visibility on your organization. And what you're really trying to find out is, what's the public image of our district? Are we seen as beneficial? Are we seen as conducting ourselves in a positive manner? Are we seen as actively engaged in contributing to the community? Those are certainly appropriate questions. And it's the amalgamation of all of those that then feeds into the review process. So usually supervisors and managers inside organizations have a pretty good idea. It's sometimes not as broad as we'd like about the employees that they're evaluating, but that is not always the case with commissions and boards of directors. Yes?
We have kind of a unique situation is we are a special library district, but we supervise or aid 12 independent other libraries. We're more of a directional.
Okay.
Would it be appropriate to talk to 2 or 3 of those directors and ask them, you know, what are your...
Absolutely. So the question is, they're a library district, and the district then supervises or is responsible for 12 different locations, library locations, correct?
Yeah, and they're all independent.
And they're all independent, but they are part of this library district. Would it make sense to go to some of those library directors and ask for their opinions and their impressions of the operation, the decisions that are made? Absolutely. Those are great ways to be able to solicit information. 1, it makes them feel important and heard. 2, you get a sense of whether or not there's a consistent response or there's very significant differences and what might cause those. That's a great way to get information.
Should just be conversation and not...
I like one, either a structured interview with 4 or 5 questions, or a form with 4 or 5 questions. It doesn't have to be a big deal, and there are some samples for things like that in the packet that's attached with your handout. So they'll need to be modified because it doesn't say library anyplace. But other than that, it should be okay. So what we need to do in thinking about this is really figure out what we're trying to accomplish and how can the commission and the board members get the broadest, best sense of the performance of the ED. And what I will say is that is rarely going to be accomplished if the board or commissioners themselves are the only input to that process. Much like anything else, if I have a boss, I'm going to do my very best to perform for my boss. I may not feel quite so compelled to perform for my coworkers or peers or all of those kinds of things, because the boss is the one who ultimately decides whether or not I stay employed and my pay levels and all those kinds of things. And so I probably am not going to be too faulted for polishing a bit that relationship. But if I know that all those constituents are feeding into my review, I have a much greater compunction to perform well on behalf of all the people I'm trying to serve. And that's just human nature. So what are some of the benefits of an ED evaluation? And I apologize, we're getting a little cut off here at the top. First of all, the board is seen as carrying out its responsibilities. One of the things that is probably dictated in your formation documents is that you are responsible for oversight of the district, its operations, its finances, etc. And so if you conduct these, this is an essential piece of fulfilling that obligation. It helps ensure that organizational goals are met. If there are specific targets or specific budgeted items or activities that were planned, are you carrying out by directing those activities and overseeing the executive director? Are you carrying out and making sure that those are done? Because you have accountability to those who elect you or appoint you in that position. And so therefore your ability to be able to carry that out may dictate whether or not you get reelected or are able to continue to serve. And those become public matters because you're a public organization. I am, in my early years of consulting with public organizations, I was somewhat surprised at the amount of candor and honest communication that took place in what I thought was a very public forum. And I probably, if I had been in charge, I probably would have used different words than some of those folks used, simply because they seemed like very strong words and very personal words in a public environment. You're in a public environment. And people make those assessments, and they expect, want, and need you to provide that kind of governance and oversight because it's taxpayers' money, it's their community, it's the district that's serving them, and those become big deals. So as a result, this is a way you carry that out. Obviously, if you are thoughtful and clear in your communications and expectations, it makes a big difference between the relationship between the ED and the board. And I want to be clear about a couple of things. The ED and the board, in some respects, are a partnership, need to be a partnership on behalf of the organization. But I would never tell you that it's a 50-50 partnership. I will tell you that it is a 60-40 at best, with that 60% resting with the board. You are the ones who are in charge. And you may not be as knowledgeable about some aspect as another, but you are expected to know whether or not things are being conducted appropriately. You have the ability to be able to bring the minds of 3 or 5 or 7 or how many ever there are of you together to collectively oversee what's taking place. It is critical that you not forget that. I have recently, over the last couple of 3 years, had occasion to work with a couple of boards who honestly admitted that they were simply intimidated by their executive director. The executive director would get angry, get hostile, get upset about the fact that you're inquiring into things that are my responsibility, not your responsibility, and so that's something we're just not going to discuss. My position description is accountable for that, and so we're moving on. And the board would move on. And that's wrong. Okay, so it's important that it enhance the relationship, but that you remember that ultimately, by all your formation documents and your responsibilities and the public's expectations, that you have to remain in charge and manage the performance of the executive director and manage it in a fashion that ensures that the results for the organization are what they need to be. Yes?
So wouldn't that alone be a drawback for doing that in public?
I thought it was.
Because it's kind of the sausage-making effect.
It was. I will tell you that I have occasionally, and I've been around for a while. I shouldn't be surprised by anything anymore, or at least I don't think I ought to be really surprised by anything anymore. But I will tell you that I have been in some public meetings where there was going to be an executive session at one point, and I was going to participate in that, and conflict has broken out. People have stood up. Members of boards and commissioners have stood up, screamed at one another, sworn at one another, in some cases thrown things at one another, and there sits the newspaper. And it's like, gosh, this may be a slightly different view than we wish to give the public. And half of the room is cheering when one person speaks, and the other half is cheering when somebody else speaks. And I'm thinking business isn't being done in a really coordinated and cohesive fashion here. So the more that you can make sure that the ED and the commission or the board is on the same page and marching towards the same goals, and we're communicating that, the better we manage things. So that's why if there's a small issue, it's better to get it taken care of when it's a small issue than when it becomes a really big deal and the public is saying, oh, Tuesday night entertainment, the board's meeting. That's not my, that's not my idea. Let them go to a movie, okay? Don't have them come to your board meeting for, the knockdown, drag out, cage fight. Not a good thing. And that if you do review